New Orleans, USA, 1808. It's a steamy, hot night in New Orleans as you walk through the French Quarter. Your commander, General Wilkinson, has based his men in a diseased swamp to protect their virtue, yet he is apparently in a brothel tonight. Greeted by the madam, you're about to ask the general's whereabouts, and you hear a braying laugh from the next room. A loud voice slurs, "Don't you worry about the British. I beat them at Saratoga, almost single-handedly. Now let me show you my most powerful weapon." With a grimace, you approach Wilkinson. He's red-faced, drunk as a skunk, with two women young enough to be his daughters fawning over him. You've heard the rumours of how he grossly exaggerated his role at Saratoga, the suspicions that he's a Spanish spy, his rampant corruption. "General Wilkinson, sir, I bring you grave news. The army is ravaged by sickness. The food being supplied to us is rotten. There are no medicines. We must move the camp to healthier sites, or the army will waste away." He blearily looks up at you. "Do not bother me with your belly aching. Can't you see I'm busy?" He swigs from a glass of wine, as much pouring down his chin than his throat. "Will you at least visit the camp and see for yourself the poor state of the army? If the British invaded, they are too sick to resist." "No need. That land is owned by my future father-in-law. He says it's fine. How can I deprive a local businessman of his livelihood? Now away from the temptations of this city, back to the swamp, camp with you." He heaves his rotund bulk out of the creaking chair and slaps one of the whore's backsides, before staggering off with the two women. You stare on with disgust and anger. How could such a man rise to command the US Army? And why are they trusting him with such a job? I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen wir 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Who is the worst traitor in American history? Benedict Arnold, who wanted to hand over West Point to the British? Aldrich Ames, who sold the CIA's secrets to the Soviets? Maybe John Walker Lind, who fought for the Taliban? Today, we are covering a man with a far better claim to that dubious title. Greedy, self-aggrandizing, and completely without morals, this Chancer would rise through the revolutionary ranks by betraying virtually everyone he served with, for, or even near. He would reach Bond villain levels of villainy, spying for Spain, plotting to split up the United States, trying to assassinate the explorers Lewis and Clark, and causing the worst peacetime disaster in the US Army's history. Welcome to the truly despicable career of that rogue of the Revolution, James Wilkinson, the notorious Agent 13. Wilkinson was born in Calvert County, Maryland, in 1757, the second of 4 children to a respectable but failed planter. By the time James came along, things were not going well. The family plantation was heavily mortgaged. When he was 6 years old, his father died, and the estate was broken up, leaving his family destitute. The lack of financial resources left a permanent impression on the young Wilkinson, who had to rely on the kindness of wealthy relatives to further his education and cover the cost of medical school in Philadelphia. He never forgot this experience and would be unhealthily obsessed with money for the rest of his life. By 1775, he was an 18-year-old student who was bored with his studies. Suddenly, news arrived of the colonists battling the British redcoats at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again for either the American colonies or the young Wilkinson. He immediately sought to join the Continental Army, but not out of any sense of the rightness of the revolutionary cause. In his autobiography, he even admitted, quote, "My youth had not allowed me time or means to investigate the merits of the controversy. It was, in truth, an impulse which characterized the times." End quote. If there was one thing Wilkinson was good at, it was networking. A born charmer, he was easily able to integrate himself with powerful men who could help his career. First of all, he wormed his way into the service of one of the brightest stars of the early revolution, Brigadier General Benedict Arnold. There is something very ironic about two of America's greatest traitors being on the same staff. Wilkinson would prove to be far better at betrayal, however. While still a favourite of Arnold's, he sought out and won over his great rival, Horatio Gates. They were quite similar men, so perhaps it wasn't surprising they got on well. Gates was also notorious for his overweening ambition, addiction to plotting, and relentless self-promotion. Gates was the only superior Wilkinson seemed to ever have any affection for, admitting it was because of, quote, "his indulgence of my self-love." End quote. Honestly, the Continental Army's leadership was a snake pit of men with titanic egos. You have to feel some sympathy for George Washington having to deal with them all. Soon he was on Gates' staff and in the thick of the action, as Washington crossed the Delaware River and won the Battle of Trenton. This was a heady time for Wilkinson, and it was only going to get better. He was present, but did no actual fighting at the battles of Saratoga, probably the key victory of the Revolution, as it persuaded the French to intervene on the colonists' side. There was a dispute, however, over who the credit for the victory should go to. Gates had been in command, but the battle had been won because of Benedict Arnold's decisive actions in defiance of his commander. Gates gave Wilkinson the honour of delivering the news of the victory to the Continental Congress. Instead of heading straight to them, he took his merry time. First he visited one of his mistresses, and after enjoying himself with her, met up with friends for some drinking and carousing. When he finally did show up to Congress, he gave all the credit to Gates, ignored Arnold's actions, and then greatly embellished his own role in the pivotal victory, so much so that he was given high honours for his fabricated heroics in the battle. These honours included being appointed to the newly created Board of War and given the honorary status of Brigadier General. Taking into account he was only 20 at the time and had barely fired a shot in anger, other, more experienced and deserving officers were outraged, and he became one of the most hated men in the army. But as so often in life, it was not what you do, but who you know. Wilkinson was flying high, but little did he know he was about to fall to earth with a bang. Washington was going through a low point in his career. Philadelphia had fallen to the British, and the Continental Army had taken a beating at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. The only bright spark was Gates' supposed success at Saratoga. With Washington vulnerable, whispers began to be heard, and letters began circulating that Washington was a dud and new, more vigorous leadership was needed. Major General Thomas Conway, a man of questionable character, whom Congress had appointed Inspector General, hatched a plot to remove Washington as commander-in-chief and install hero of the hour Gates in his place. Wilkinson was knee-deep in the so-called Conway cabal, but unintentionally became the main reason Washington would survive. It's taking all your strength to get through this insufferable dinner party. Wilkinson is as drunk as a skunk, his face rosy with wine, and his braying laugh is really getting on your last nerve. As he launches into yet another account of his supposed heroics at Saratoga, you groan inside. You have friends who fought in those battles. He did nothing except carry Gates's papers. As he leers at the woman present, including your own wife, he suddenly says something that makes your ears prick up. Washington doesn't deserve to command the army. We need a real man in charge. A general of talent. Conway thinks so too. Wilkinson has always been publicly supportive of Washington. Why is he suddenly having such conversations with a rogue like Conway? Does Gates know about this, you wonder? Plastering a smile to your face, you pour him another drink. Tell me more, James. Gulping down the drink, he starts proudly boasting. Letters are being exchanged among the true patriots and men of distinction. Conway himself told General Gates that heaven had been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counsellors would have ruined it. Those are his exact words, old boy. That oath Washington's days are done. Gates is the future. He will lead the army to victory, mark my words. Washington must know about this immediately. A conspiracy is afoot. Let me pour you another drink, my dear fellow. A hero of the Revolution, such as yourself, you can tell me all about it. That's right. Wilkinson revealed the whole secret affair while drunkenly boasting at a dinner party. General William Alexander was present and quickly alerted Washington. When the commander-in-chief exposed the Conway cabal, the conspiracy foundered, and Conway ultimately resigned in disgrace. When later questioned about the leak by an irate Gates, Wilkinson tried to deflect blame onto an unsuspecting friend and fellow officer. What a stand-up guy. But then Washington himself revealed who the source had been. Gates and his former crony's relationship never recovered. Instead, they became bitter enemies. They almost fought a duel, but got called off at the last minute. With the shadow of the Conway debacle hanging over him and the loss of his patron, Wilkinson resigned both his commission and his position on the Board of War. As usual, he landed on his feet. On November the 12th, 1778, he entered into a marriage with a wealthy Philadelphia socialite, Anne Biddle, with whom he would have 4 sons. In July 1779, he accepted the congressional appointment to the post of Clothier General of the Army. Bored with the work and dissatisfied as always with the pay, he resigned less than a year later, claiming it wasn't good enough for him. He was restless after leaving government service. He dabbled in politics, serving in the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and kept his hand in military matters as a brigadier in the state militia. Seeking still greener pastures, he moved to what was then the rough-and-ready Virginia frontier district of Kentucky, where he lobbied for statehood and tried his hand at land speculation. Nothing legitimate seemed to work out for him, though, so he decided to become a traitor, as you do. At the time, war with Spain was an ever-present possibility. Spain controlled 3 times as much territory in North America as did the infant United States, and was determined to prevent the new nation from spreading its wings westward. The ever-plotting Wilkinson spotted an opportunity. King Carlos IV had earlier banned all foreigners from trading on the Mississippi River, that vital artery for the West that led to the port of New Orleans in the Gulf. Negotiating through Esteban Rodriguez Miro, governor of the sprawling Spanish territory of Louisiana, Wilkinson convinced the Spanish that if he were granted a trade monopoly with New Orleans, he would work in their interests to discourage further American expansion. The monopoly was granted, and to cement the agreement, Wilkinson signed a declaration of allegiance to the King of Spain. To put this in a modern context, imagine if a former American general and politician suddenly received a monopoly on selling Russian oil from Vladimir Putin. I'm sure there'll be some suspicious side-eyes, if not alarm bells ringing. However, for some reason, this wouldn't be the case with Wilkinson. For the next few years, the turncoat merchant carried on a lucrative trade. He also attempted, unsuccessfully, to sway Kentuckians' loyalties away from the United States and towards the King of Spain. However, despite his unfair trading advantage, Wilkinson proved both inept and unlucky in business. As treason proved more lucrative, he ultimately expanded his deal with Spain into a decades-long career of espionage. He would sell American secrets to the Spaniards for silver. The spy and his Spanish masters communicated using an elaborate cipher codenamed Number 13, and the Spanish took to calling their new American agent by that name. As long as the code remained unbroken, which it did, his treason could not be proven. Still, Wilkinson lived in constant fear of discovery. One of his major worries centered on how the Spanish smuggled their payoffs to him. They were conveyed by a messenger aboard river vessels in the form of silver dollars, which were cumbersome and difficult to conceal. To muffle the noise during transport, he had them packed into barrels of coffee or casks of rum. He also kept a file of forged and false documents, should he need to bluff his way out of trouble. Despite all his preparations, he had a number of close calls where his treachery could have been discovered. On one occasion, the crewman of a boat he'd hired murdered a courier carrying his $3,000 payoff from Spain. They were soon caught and hauled before a judge. It seemed Agent 13 was done for. However, if there was one skill Wilkinson had apart from charm, it was getting himself out of trouble. The crew only spoke Spanish, so he arranged for one of his confederates to be the court translator. The translator completely garbled the prisoner's statements, and the elusive spy once again narrowly escaped detection. It can certainly be argued that George Washington was often a bad judge of character. Despite Wilkinson's role in the Conway cabal, and numerous people warning him about his dubious links with the Spanish, he gave Agent 13 a commission in the new army he was creating. Even more astonishing, he then made him second in command of said army. Again, this is a man who has been campaigning for Kentucky to join the Empire of Spain, and was mysteriously granted exclusive trading privileges by Carlos IV himself. Yet apparently, this rang no alarm bells. As he always did, it wasn't long before Wilkinson was devoting all his time to undermining his superior, General Wayne, so he could take his job. While this campaign failed, the untimely death of Wayne meant he lucked out and became the senior officer of the U.S. Army. Arguably, he is the highest-ranking traitor America's ever had. The real money now started flowing in. Spain paid him $32,000, about $600,000 in today's money, for sharing the military's plans and troop movements of the very army he was now in charge of. While he was selling every secret the army possessed, Wilkinson also had a profitable sideline in betraying the expedition sent by President Jefferson to explore the Louisiana Territory after he purchased it from Napoleon. Mystified why these missions kept disappearing with no trace, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on a supposedly scientific expedition to the Pacific Ocean. For non-American listeners, Lewis and Clark are now national heroes, and their journey across the American West to the Pacific is famous. For Wilkinson, though, they were just another payday. He immediately informed the Spanish of the explorers' true purpose, to map and establish an American presence in the newly acquired territory. In an act of open treason, Wilkinson advised Spain to, quote, detach a sufficient body of cavalry to intercept Captain Lewis and his party, end quote. Thankfully, the Spanish were unable to find the explorers. Had they succeeded, Lewis and Clark might have vanished into unmarked graves. For his attempt to assassinate soon-to-be national heroes, Wilkinson was paid $12,000 and given an annual trade deal with Havana. And I have to state again, he was head of the army while he was doing all of this. The more I learn about the early years of the United States, the more I'm sometimes amazed it survived. Life continued to get better for Agent 13. While still running the army, Jefferson also appointed him the first governor of the Louisiana Territory, which made up about 1/3 of today's continental USA. This wasn't by accident. He had made a new friend who had persuaded Jefferson to give him this plum role. Aaron Burr, of Hamilton fame, had need of a man with the morals of a rattlesnake and a love of cold, hard cash. The former U.S. Vice President was down on his luck after killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel. This is the part they don't show you in the musical. Rather than settling for the quiet life, he came up with one of the most audacious plots in the history of America. His exact goals are still unclear, even today, but at a minimum he seems to have planned to form a breakaway new North American nation, made up of the Louisiana Territory, the western U.S. states, at this time that meant Tennessee, Kentucky, etc., and conquer Spanish-controlled Texas. Burr himself would be president, of course, and Wilkinson was going to run the army and be his second-in-command. Backed by a murky collection of wealthy planters, army officers and statesmen, Burr liked his chances. But he had trusted the wrong man, as he did to everyone and everything. Wilkinson betrayed Burr. He had begun to have second thoughts, worried that Burr wouldn't succeed, and that his own spying for Spain would be revealed. Wilkinson contacted President Jefferson, warning that he was shocked, I tell you, that Burr was planning such treason against the good old US of A. To be fair to Jefferson, it seems like he guessed Wilkinson wasn't a naive innocent in this whole sordid affair, but luckily for Agent 13, he was more interested in ruining Burr. They seemed to have come to an unspoken agreement. The general would provide whatever evidence the president required, including perjury, that would achieve Burr's conviction for treason. Jefferson, in turn, would provide whatever whitewash was needed to shield Wilkinson from any accountability for his treachery and incompetence. Like a conjurer pulling a rabbit out of a hat, Wilkinson suddenly produced a letter he claimed was from Burr, confirming the former vice president's treason. It was shocking stuff. There was just one problem. It was mostly written in Wilkinson's own handwriting. He had amended said letter to put himself in the best light. His self-serving testimony was filled with obvious lies and went down like a lead balloon. It then emerged that he had placed New Orleans under martial law so he could arrest 7 people who could link him to Burr. When their lawyers protested, he had them arrested too. All in all, Wilkinson achieved the remarkable feat of making Burr look like a victim of an overzealous government. Burr was acquitted, though his reputation never recovered. Agent 13's reputation took a massive hit too. The grand jury came very close to indicting him for not revealing the treasonous plot sooner, whilst the jury foreman lambasted Wilkinson as a, quote, mammoth of iniquity, the most finished scoundrel, the only man that I ever saw who was from bark to the very core a villain, end quote. Wilkinson lost his plum job as governor of the Louisiana Territory. Ironically, he was replaced by Meriwether Lewis, the same explorer he had betrayed to the Spanish and plotted to kill. He faced a court-martial, though thanks to some help from Jefferson, it exonerated him of all charges. Despite all of this sorry affair, somehow he was still left in charge of the U.S. Army. Next, our hero was ordered by Jefferson in the fall of 1808 to take the newly expanded U.S. Army to New Orleans to defend the lower Mississippi from an expected invasion by Great Britain. While tensions were rising between America and Britain, soon to erupt into the War of 1812, this time U.S. intelligence was off. British soldiers were actually going to the Caribbean island of Martinique to invade. What should have been a peaceful stay in the South turned into the largest peacetime disaster the U.S. Army has ever suffered, and this occurred mainly thanks to corruption and incompetence of one James Wilkinson. The deployment to New Orleans was already a mess. This was because the new Secretary of Defense, William Eustis, had no understanding of how to provision or quarter an army. As the Green regiments arrived in the city, each unit was responsible for finding its own quarters and provisions. They were told to pay out of pocket and charge the War Department for any incurred expenses. When Wilkinson arrived, he thundered Old Testament style that the army had to move out of the unhealthy flesh pot of New Orleans, where the city's many diversions would, quote, divert our green officers from due attention to their profession, end quote. If this seems out of character, it's because it was. Agent 13 did not fear for the morals or efficiency of his army. Instead, he had seen a chance to make a fast buck. He entered into a corrupt relationship with the contractor that had been hastily chosen to supply the food to the army. In return for a hefty bribe, the general agreed to overlook the deliveries of spoiled provisions and food a rat wouldn't eat. The flour was particularly bad, being mouldy, worm-infested, and at times so hard as to challenge an axe. Next, the general assumed sole responsibility for finding a suitable location for the army away from the vices of New Orleans. After a very short search, Wilkinson chose a site south of the city. Terre aux Bœufs, or Land of the Oxen. This was a bad choice to say the least. It was a pestilent swamp, known for having large pools of stagnant water. And where you find stagnant pools of water, you get germ-carrying mosquitoes. Why did he pick this lovely piece of real estate? The reason soon became clear. Inevitably, money and women were involved. While his men set up camp in the lethal swampland, Wilkinson was courting a much younger woman who was the daughter of a former Spanish official in New Orleans. It just so happened that her father had a hidden ownership interest in this particular piece of swampland. but I'm sure that didn't influence his decision. Don't be silly. Nothing to see here. This new encampment turned into a living hell. Troops were housed in tents on bare ground that was subjected to frequent flooding when the Mississippi overflowed its banks. Often they were up to their knees in mud. Field sanitation was virtually non-existent, and the food was rancid or inedible, resulting in malnutrition, scurvy, and explosive diarrhea. Then the mosquitoes started biting. Soon those poor soldiers were also racked by malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, typhoid, and pneumonia. As more and more soldiers fell ill, medicine failed to arrive. The contractor had bribed Wilkinson so they got paid, but didn't have to provide any actual medicines. Soon, even the limited medical personnel available had fallen ill and were unable to tend to their fellow soldiers. Wilkinson recruited local private physicians, but for a handy kickback, they didn't actually have to visit this camp of the damned. While his diseased and starving army rotted away in the swamps, Wilkinson was having a grand old time in New Orleans. By day he courted his future wife, by night he whored and drank himself into a stupor. Good to know that he was taking one for the team and protecting his men from the tempting vices of the city. News of the unfolding disaster reached Secretary Eustis, but he was more concerned about how much money it was all costing. To be fair, Wilkinson was probably padding the bills. Eustis declared that the horses were too expensive to maintain and they must be sold off, even the ones that were used to move artillery. How the batteries were supposed to function without horses was never addressed. He refused to allocate any more money for food or medicines for the sick soldiers, saying they must learn to do more with less, which I'm sure was inspiring for the troops as they suffered with malaria and explosive diarrhea. Eustis did suggest the camp could be moved to a healthier area, but never followed this up when Wilkinson ignored him. His main focus was on cutting those costs. By this point, the death rate among the army was approaching catastrophic levels, while desertions were occurring every day. Increasingly distressed messages were sent to Wilkinson, as we saw in the opening dramatization, begging him to visit the camp and see how bad conditions had become. He ignored them. Finally, in September 1809, Wilkinson agreed to redeploy the army to the Natchez, 300 miles upriver from the swamps of Terre-aux-Boeufs. During the move, sickness and death and desertion continued to plague the army. Each night, the river fleet hired by Wilkinson came ashore to bury the dead. Because of the absence of medical supplies, officers took up a private collection to construct a hospital to care for the sick troops. Agent 13 refused to contribute himself, pleading poverty. Then he claimed to be ill, so he left the army and went back to New Orleans to recover, and incidentally completed the courtship of his new wife. Wilkinson was finally relieved of his command in November 1809. Overall, casualties from the deployment were horrendous. Of the 2,036 enlisted men in the field, over 900 of them had died from diseases and malnutrition. Another 160 soldiers deserted. Over 40 officers died or resigned their commissions rather than continue to serve under Wilkinson. It remains the worst peacetime disaster ever suffered by the U.S. Army. America was lucky that the British didn't invade the Mississippi at this point. All there was to stop them was an army already destroyed by one General Wilkinson. Despite these horrendous losses, Wilkinson was never held accountable for his incompetence and corruption. A series of congressional committees examined the debacle, but failed to hold him to account. Hoping to avoid a scandal, Wilkinson, Eustis, and the new President James Madison determined that another sham trial would absolve the general for all the blame, as well as quash mounting concerns over Wilkinson's relationship with Spain and Burr. In the fall of 1812 came the show trial. Wilkinson was court-martialed for numerous charges relating to these matters, but he himself was allowed to select the charges and was directly involved in the selection of the military jury. During the court-martial, almost half the jury testified on Wilkinson's behalf. It should come as no surprise that he was acquitted of all charges in February 1812. If anyone listening to this podcast is ever in trouble with the law, I hope we're all so fortunate that we can pick our own jury and pick our own charges. Surely, though, his career in the US military must be over now, I hear you say. Well, despite all the rumours of spying for Spain, the shadow of the Burr conspiracy, his near indictment, a military court-martial, and the scandal that was Terre aux Bouffes, instead, they promoted him to Major General. When the War of 1812 against the British broke out, America came up with a daring and ambitious plan to invade British-controlled Canada. The fact that Canada is still independent is mainly because they chose General Wilkinson to lead the said invasion. The plan was to take Montreal and cut Canada in half, with Wilkinson leading an army of 8,000 troops, massively outnumbering the British forces available. With Canada cut in half, the colony would fall like a ripe peach into American hands. What could possibly go wrong? The answer is quite a lot. Agent 13 wasn't nearly as good a field commander as he was at treason. Still, when he first arrived to take command, he was cheered by the troops, with one officer writing that, quote, "General Wilkinson has infused new spirit into the troops at this post. He inspired a degree of confidence in every officer and soldier that I never saw equalled." End quote. This misplaced confidence in Wilkinson soon began to slip away. Just like in New Orleans, merchants were allowed to get away with provisioning Wilkinson's new army with rotten food and equipment, if they gave him a kickback, of course. Soon his men were subsisting on rotten meat, stagnant water, and bread that was found to have been mixed with bits of soap, lime, and even fecal matter. In just 2 months, 1,400 officers and men were incapacitated by illness. That's what happens when your army is literally eating poo. As sickness ravaged the army, the campaign was delayed and the British were given vital time to prepare. Indeed, it took Wilkinson's men 19 days to simply load their boats with provisions, a task that the frustrated contractors agent insisted could have been done in only 5. Finally, though, they were on their way down the river, when Agent 13 got some comeuppance at last, and came down with the dysentery that was plaguing his men. The general was soon confined to his bunk, plying himself with whiskey and opium to ward off the symptoms. In his fevered, drunk, and drug-induced state, he tried to raise morale with motivational statements such as, quote, "Our artillery, bayonets, and swords must secure our triumph, or provide us honourable graves." End quote. This didn't have quite the effect he was hoping for on the starving and sick soldiers. The flotilla was taking its merry time, crawling along at a snail's pace of only 10 kilometres a day. All the while it was being regularly sniped at by Canadian militiamen and endured hit-and-run raids by British gunboats. These didn't actually do much damage, but the constant threat wore on the nerves of the Americans. A frustrated Wilkinson ordered Major Benjamin Forsyth to go ashore and chase off the snipers. However, Forsyth was more interested in plundering than fighting. He went on an epic looting spree of local farms and houses. Whatever sympathy had existed locally for the American cause vanished in the blink of an eye. A leading British officer even wrote to Wilkinson to protest the, quote, system of rapine and plunder of the property of the peaceful and unoffending inhabitants, which has marked the progress of the American army, end quote. The miserable Wilkinson received yet another blow when he found out the other American army involved in the invasion had retreated and abandoned the fight. At a council of war, he tried to persuade his officers that they too should retreat. However, they urged him to continue instead. While all this was going on, the British had managed to scrape together about 800 men to resist the Americans. Even in his fevered state, Wilkinson knew this force would have to be defeated first before he could head on to Montreal. Over 2,000 Americans disembarked and prepared to engage the British, but they were without their favourite general. He begged off leading them due to sickness, but he did give his deputy, General John Parker Boyd, a detailed plan for victory. Sadly, the plan was absolute rubbish. Normal American army tactics at this time was to take shelter behind trees and rocks, peppering the redcoats with highly accurate fire. This had helped win them the Revolutionary War, but it wasn't good enough for Wilkinson. Instead, his plan called for his soldiers to march across open ground and fight the British like a European army would. The British couldn't believe their luck. Wilkinson's men were going to fight them with tactics and on ground that suited them perfectly. Still, the British were massively outnumbered. Surely, by sheer force of numbers, America could triumph here. Marching across open ground, the Americans were beaten back by massed fire from the British. Then, the turning point of the whole battle arrived. This has been a grim campaign so far. You all had high hopes for General Wilkinson, but he has brought you nothing but disease, rotten food, and chronic diarrhea. Even now, you are struggling to control your bowels as you prepare to fight the British. Under General Covington, you advance through the wheat fields towards the Chrysler farm. A big smile appears on his face as he sees that the soldiers are wearing grey coats, not red. You'll be facing easier Canadian militia, not British regulars. "Come, lads," he shouts. "Let me see how you will deal with these mere militiamen." Confidently he strides forward, a smirk of triumph on his face. You yell your battle cry and charge. That's when it all goes wrong. A devastating volley of bullets smashes into your ranks. Men collapse all around you. By some miracle, you are unhurt. The same cannot be said for Covington. He is now lying on the floor, a startled expression on his now lifeless face. Those are British regulars, not militiamen. Covington's second in command picks up the stars and stripes and waves it, yelling, "Come on, lads, to victory!" Then, yet another volley crashes into your lines, and his head explodes in a crimson mist. The third in command races forward to take charge, but soon clutches his stomach and falls to the floor. That's when morale collapses, and you begin running for your lives. The whole battle was a disaster for Wilkinson. With most of the army having fled, Boyd called for a retreat back to the boats. Despite massively outnumbering their enemy, they had been defeated, and they'd lost 102 killed, 237 wounded, and 120 taken prisoner. British casualties were just 31 dead. The Battle of Chrysler's Farm had been a debacle, but it shouldn't have been a knockout blow. The Americans still had plenty of troops, and massively outnumbered the British, even now, but the sick and dispirited Wilkinson had lost heart. The army retreated, and Montreal was safe. It wouldn't be threatened again for the rest of the war. The American flotilla sailed up the Salmon River, a tributary that brought them to the small community of French mills on the New York State side of the border. Boasting that he would renew the campaign come spring, Wilkinson decided to winter here, ordering his men to set up camp in this area that was essentially wilderness. This is important because it would lead to yet another disaster. There were 230 miles of roads connecting French mills to the nearest supply depot at Plattsburgh, which was soon inaccessible with the onset of winter and the falling of the first snows. Before long, hunger and cold caused 2,000 more men to fall sick, with 216 dying in December alone. Funeral dirges became so common that Wilkinson banned them so as not to further demoralize his men. Before long, it became clear that Wilkinson's army was in no condition to launch a new campaign, and he was ordered to withdraw in 1814. Wilkinson's reputation sank to new lows. Winfield Scott, a future war hero and general, but for now just an up-and-coming officer, claimed that serving under Wilkinson was, quote, as disgraceful as being married to a prostitute, end quote, facing yet another court-martial. Agent 13 looked desperately for an easy victory that could save his military career. Then he noticed a small British garrison of just 80 men guarding the Coal River. Surely this would be a cakewalk for his 4,000-man army. The Second Battle of the Coal River was a minor event in the War of 1812, but it is a fascinating battle nonetheless. Small garrisons have heroically held off much larger forces before, but normally there's a massive difference in weapons technology, like at, say, Rorke's Drift in South Africa. None of this applied at Le Col. Wilkinson was not a strategic genius by any stretch of the imagination, but just through sheer attrition and throwing men at the mill, he could have won this battle. How did he manage to turn it into a defeat? The British were defending a stout blockhouse with a solid stone watermill. While they had no artillery, they were equipped with the new concrete rockets. Terribly inaccurate though they were, when they did hit the Americans, they caused significant casualties and panic. A bullet whizzes past your ear, and the American behind you cries out, falling to the floor, clutching his leg. A cannon roars, but its shot doesn't even make a dent on the stone mill. This is ridiculous. What is that fool Wilkinson playing at? There are only 18 men in that mill, yet he refuses to order an advance. The army is merely standing in the snow, exchanging fire with the British. The redcoats at least had the shelter of the mill and the stockade to take pot shots at you. Meanwhile, you're stuck out in the open. Perfect targets for sharpshooters. Fed up, you approach General Wilkinson. General, sir, surely it is time to order an advance on the mill. We outnumber them. It can easily be stormed. A whistling sound fills the air, and you flinch as another of those rockets smashes into the American lines. I will attack when I am good and ready. Now back to the lines with you. As you trudge back, you wish someone else was in command. Anybody would be better. Rather than launching a full assault with his overwhelming force, which would have won the day, Wilkinson settled for exchanging fire with the British instead. It was a bizarre decision. The ground was too soft for his heavy artillery, and what cannons he could use were useless against the stone mill. The firefight continued for so long that the surrounding British garrisons, about 420 men in total, got into the fight. Despite being terribly outnumbered, some of the reinforcements snuck through the American lines and raided their artillery. They wounded the artillery commander and several officers, wreaking havoc on the Americans. Eventually, the battle went on so long that British gunboats managed to sail up the river and rain fire down on Wilkinson's men as well. Still not committing to a full attack, the blundering Wilkinson ordered a retreat instead. He lost 41 dead, 226 wounded or missing. The British lost only 11 dead and 50 wounded or missing. The disastrous battle led to another military inquiry, in addition to the court-martial for the earlier battle at Chrysler's farm. Really, it was an absolute farce, and Wilkinson was solely to blame. His campaign had been a complete failure, yet somehow he still managed to beat the charges and was acquitted at the courts-martial, mainly due to a lack of witnesses on the government's behalf. Still, this time, his career in the American government and in the US military was finally over. Terrible with money as always, Wilkinson's funds were soon drying up, and there were no new government jobs coming his way to replenish them. Desperately in need of a fresh start, and envisioning himself the perfect advisor to the Emperor Augustinov of the newly independent Mexico, the 65-year-old American sailed for Vera Cruz in 1822. His plans fell apart, however, when the Emperor abdicated the following year. To be honest, it was probably lucky for the Emperor. He'd just been stabbed in the back by Wilkinson, as he'd done to so many others. On December the 28th, 1825, having grown increasingly ill and devoid of both money and influence, Wilkinson finally died in Mexico City. It wasn't until 1854 that he was finally unmasked as one of America's worst traitors by the historian Charles Guerre. Throughout his life, Wilkinson lied, cheated and plotted, all the while charming his way out of personal jeopardy. He has had appropriately bad press. Theodore Roosevelt wrote of Wilkinson that, quote, "In all our history there is no more despicable character," end quote. Frederick Jackson Turner condemned him as, quote, "the most consummate artist in treason that the nation has ever possessed," end quote. But probably the most appropriate last word on this rogue of the Revolution comes from historian Robert Leckie. Quote, "Wilkinson was a general who never won a battle or lost a court-martial," end quote. Thanks for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, we head back to North Africa for Operation Flipper, the epic failed commando mission to kill General Erwin Rommel. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.